The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
And I think that that's so much of how a story comes to be is you've got this one thing and it's niggling one side of your brain. And then you wind up with something else that comes in and suddenly the interaction of the two is where it comes to life.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Carrie Givens is a publisher and co-founder of Bandersnatch Books. She's also the author of the recently released novel, Rosefire. Carrie and I sat down to talk about writers' groups, dry spells, the role of namers in our creative lives, and those characters who just show up unbidden in the stories we write. Carrie Givens, I'm so glad that you're on the Habit Podcast.
Thank you. I'm really glad I'm on the Habit Podcast.
So your new, not brand new, but pretty new novel, Rosefire, came out in the summer through Bandersnatch Books.
Yes.
Tell me about Bandersnatch Books and why is it called that?
Yes.
That's what you call a softball.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that because, I need some leverage. So Bandersnatch Books is a new small press publisher that actually I started with two friends, Annie Beth Donahue and Rachel Donahue. And the three of us have all been in the world of writing for a long time. All of us are writers. All of us have had interest in publishing over the years. And all of us have run into the mantra that I know I heard multiple times from bigger institutions, whether that's editors for publishers or agents or whatever, that was, this is really good. It doesn't fit into the right categories. I don't know how I'd sell it. And so that was really the impetus because we knew we were in that boat. And we also knew that we have a whole lot of friends who have found themselves in the similar boat. And their options at that point are often self-publish or don't get it out there. And most of us are not we might be able to write a really good book, but we don't have the skill set for printing it or distributing it or marketing it or any of that. And there's, there are some, print on demand is not as terrible as it used to be. Right. There's some options for getting it out there, but you get a little bit more weight with an organization behind you. And between Rachel and Annie Beth and I, we had quite a few of those skill sets. I've worked in communications for years, so I learned how to talk to printers 15 years ago, and so things like that. And so we kind of said, well, we've got a good set of skills, and the things that we don't know how to do, we know people who know how to do, and we can ask them questions or hire them, subcontract them for things. And so we decided, you know what, let's start a publishing company. And we had actually all been in a writing group together that was based off of our structure and our function, like how we functioned, was actually based off of Diana Gleyer's book, Bandersnatch. We used kind of the format that she gives and the questions that she asks in there for how we gave feedback to one another. And so we called ourselves the Band of Bandersnatches. Now, her Bandersnatch is out of a Lewis Tolkien quote, where I think it's Lewis says about Tolkien, nobody can influence Tolkien, you might as well try to influence a Bandersnatch. A Bandersnatch originally is from Lewis Carroll, and it's the Jabberwocky section of Through the Looking Glass. There's a Bandersnatch in there.
So y'all are making a reference to a reference to a
reference. Exactly. I mean, we really believe in taking it all the way to the nth degree of association. So I've told Diana Gleyer, she's our grandmother, like she's my book's grandmother, and somehow. And so it's been really fun to really look for those books that are off the beaten path, look for those authors that, they might have a book that the book itself, a general market publisher would pick it up, but the author doesn't have the platform that they want, or things like that. And so that's kind of been our goal. And we're starting small, and we're starting with our own stuff so that we can screw up on our own books before we start screwing up on other people's. And so the first title that we put out was Rosefire.
Yeah, and y'all started Bandersnatch during the pandemic, correct? Do I have that right?
We did. We looked around and said, what should three women who are, nearing middle age do during a pandemic when two of them have 4 children at home each, and one of them has a full-time job that's highly demanding? What should we do? We should start a company and publish other people's books. That just seemed like a brilliant idea.
But it's a project that grew out of friendship and out of, I love it. And I love, even the name, the fact that the name of the company is a reference to a reference to a reference, right? You're referring to Diana's book, which was referring to Lewis's quote, which was referring to, Lewis Carroll, which I think that really was the original, right? I believe so.
I think he just made up the word.
Yeah. But it's fun to think of you are entering into the conversation, right? In that name, you're entering into a conversation that's been going on for a while.
Exactly. And that's one of my things, like that art begets art. And I love talking about that and thinking about that. And I think that the fact that we wound up with the name we have for Bandersnatch is just another element of that.
Yeah, right. Well, tell me, so you already mentioned you have a full-time job, and yet you managed to write Rosefire, and which is your second novel you've written.
Yes, yep.
So you are not giving your primary work hours to writing. So tell me about that process, how you made this happen.
How I made this happen. Well, not only that, but I also really like sleep. And so, there's not a lot of time when I'm not working or sleeping. So for me, it was a very long process. It took me about 5 years to write a first draft, and then another 7 years to get it published, to get it all the way to being a book in real life. So, from initial seed idea, we're talking fall of 2008 for the initial seed idea. And I think, I listen to your podcast and I read your emails and I think I want to be a writer with really good habits and writing habits. And I think I have some, but I'm not great at them. I'm not great at the making that the priority, and whether that's on a daily basis or a weekly basis, making sure that I'm always doing that. And that's because there's a lot else going on. I'm working full time. I'm running my house. I'm taking my cats to the vet. I'm hiring someone to mow my lawn because I'm like, it's way too hot to do that. All of those things that I'm kind of doing. And so for me, writing kind of comes in fits and spurts. But it's also always been, I'm motivated by the people around me who are interested in reading it or wanting to, that are encouraging me to keep going. And so being in a writer's group, which I will say, in launching Bandersnatch books, our writers group part of the meetings, we haven't done quite so much. And we're all looking this fall going, okay, we need to get back to that. And make sure we're doing that. So, but that was I'd write to a meeting and be inspired from the meeting and write from a meeting.
I like that language, writing to a meeting and writing from a meeting.
And I mean, I think back and I'm like, when I taught college freshmen, I'm like, this is not how you should write, but I figure I have an editing process afterwards. So, but just getting the text out, getting the story out. And so in writing even my first book is The King's Messenger, and that I wrote as short stories over the course of 8 years, and so again, it might have even been 12 years until I got all, and eventually then I shaped those short stories into chapters of a whole. But it came out just a little bit at a time. And for Rosefire, it was a similar process of, I had the idea, I started kind of writing scenes. I don't plan, I don't outline. I have sort of thematic ideas that I want to tell a story about. Usually characters walk into my imagination and introduce themselves, and then they demand a story to live in. And so I have to figure out, here's this character, here's this theme. And
so I hear people say that kind of, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's great. Go for it.
I hear people say the things like the character introduced, the characters come in and introduce themselves. Can you say, what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
Can you say that? Can you be more specific about that?
Absolutely. I'll give you a couple of examples. That's, as specific as I can get. So for Rosefire, for example, I spent a lot of time in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. I was introduced to it in college, and it is one of my absolute favorite poems. And it's one that I just go back to and just sort of wash my brain in regularly. Yeah. And
I approve of that.
Thank you. I'm here for all the Four Quartets promo. Yeah. And there's a couplet in there that's, ash on an old man's sleeve is all the ash the burnt roses leave. And one of the times I was reading Four Quartets, that image, ash on an old man's sleeve, immediately was an elderly monk shaking ash off of his sleeve. And that image winds up in the final chapter of Rosefire. But I knew, as soon as I had that image of the elderly monk, I had this old man. And I was like, I can't remember for sure if he had the name Ezra immediately, but I had this old man who was a monk and the reason there was ash on his sleeve was because roses had been burned, and that's another, roses and fire. There's a lot of that in Four Quartets. Yeah. And so then it was just okay, what's the backstory there? What's Ezra's story to tell? And so it was just sort of digging into who is this character. And fairly quickly after that, I had Karen and Anya and Richard, who are kind of my other four main characters. And so that's just one example where he came not fully formed but he came as a person. And I then had to figure out, okay, exactly who is this person and what's the story he wants to live in. And then
I like that idea that you say he came as a person, not as a fully formed person. Like, it's just, it feels like you've got to know just enough to then investigate.
Exactly.
That character's still going to reveal himself to you.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, my first book, The King's Messenger, the main character is Smuggins, and that the very first story I wrote in college, and again, it was a line of poetry. We were reading Milton's When I Consider How My Light Is Spent. And the final couplet of that is, they also serve who only stand and wait. And I'm sitting in a class in college. The teacher is talking about this poem. We're discussing it. And I suddenly have a messenger for the king who's only ever waited. He's never actually been called on to serve.
Yeah.
And so suddenly it was this digging into who is this? You know, what's his story? What's he going to do? And then he eventually became Smuggins. And that's another that, like, the name, I didn't go digging for the name Smuggins. It's kind of a silly name, but he came with it. And another within Rosefire, kind of my other main character beyond the four I've mentioned, is Edmund. And that's one where it was as I was writing, I knew I kind of have sort of tent poles of where the story's heading. Once I start writing, I'm like, okay, it's going to get to this point, and it's going to get to this point, and it's going to get to this point, and eventually it'll get to an end. And I knew I needed to get from wherever I was to the next point, and I needed somebody outside the family to come into the story to just sort of move the action along. And so I had family friends come for a meal. And my intention was in my book, in the story. Yeah. So family friends, right. I mean, it could happen in real life too, but no, in the story, family friends come for a meal. And in my intention in writing that chapter was, this character is basically going to get my protagonist from point A to point B, you know, the interaction with this character. And at the end of the chapter, I was like, oh, he's a main character. Oh, he's got a whole arc of his own. Oh, I better change his name because I don't like William. And so I had to go back and, you know, and put a few more things into the earlier part of the chapter, and I changed his name to Edmund. But he then wound up becoming one of my favorite characters in the book. And again, you know, it's Madeleine L'Engle talks about in The Arm of the Starfish. She talks about this in the book Walking on Water, but in her book The Arm of the Starfish, her character Adam wakes up in a hotel room, and Joshua, who's another character, is sitting in the chair in the corner. And she had not planned for Joshua to be sitting in the chair in the corner. She didn't have a character in her book named Joshua. And she says, you know, he was sitting in the corner, and I knew the moment I saw him there in the corner that he was going to sacrifice his life for Adam. And his name was Joshua. And she's like, I had to go back and rewrite whole sections of the book in order for him to do what, you know, he needed to do. But I just think there are ways that, you know, characters people your imagination and ask for a story to live in, and you want to figure out what the right one is. Yeah.
I know in 1991, well, it was about 1991, 1992, 93, somewhere along in there, somebody told me a story about his grandmother who grew up in California, and he had the grandmother had maybe an Austrian father and a Scottish mother, or vice versa, and they lived in California. And then, but this little girl dreamed of kangaroos, and she had never seen a kangaroo, had never been to the zoo. They didn't have kangaroos in her part of California, you know, and so she saw a kangaroo in a book, and she said, "That's what I dream about." You know, that was, but she knew what kangaroos were, and yet she was just this little girl in California, a small town California. And she never knew why she knew about kangaroos.
Right.
And then after she grew up, she discovered that she wasn't from California. She was from Australia, and that her mother wasn't her mother, and that her father, who actually, now I remember, the father was Scottish, the mother was Austrian or German, a German-speaking person. Her father was her father, but her mother was her nanny. Her nanny, and they ran off and moved to California. And so when she was a little teeny weeny, before she could remember, she had seen news. And so she discovers at age 20 or whatever that she's an Australian.
Right.
And that story just made a huge impression on me. And then what I wrote The Charlatan's Boy in 2008. So that's 15 years later. I was sort of just thinking about, the fact that we don't know, none of us know where we came from, right?
Yeah.
Somebody tells us. And so that, so the first line of The Charlatan's Boy is, I don't know one thing about the day I was born. And he's a person who doesn't know that, the only person who can tell him who he is a liar.
Yeah.
And so that whole story grew out of that idea.
I love that. And it's that just letting something marinate and, and it pulls together. Somebody just recently, I think I was listening to the With You Windle podcast, and somebody that was on there, maybe it may have even been Sam Smith, SD Smith. But they were talking about how you don't need to write a good story or a good book. You don't need just one good idea. You need a few of them, and you need to find where they interact and where they interface. And I think that that's so much of how a story comes to be is you've got this one thing, and it's niggling one side of your brain. And then you wind up with something else that comes in, and suddenly the interaction of the two is where it comes to life.
Now, I would add one caveat. You don't need just one idea. You need multiple good ideas.
Right.
But you don't need 100 good ideas.
True. Exactly.
It's always surprising to me when how few, so if you write a 250-page book, you don't need 250 good ideas.
No. Yeah.
You need a few. And then you need to play them out.
Right.
And then in the process, you will have some more good ideas. But I think that's a remarkable thing. You also don't need pages and pages and pages of beautiful sentences.
Right.
You need some beautiful sentences.
Yep.
It's surprising how few good sentences you actually have to have before it starts to feel like the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
A lot of it's just blocking and tackling, kind of.
Exactly.
Moving things along.
And that was, for me in terms of, living a life and I kind of wrote to the end of every chapter. Yeah. And it was like, okay. And looking back at it now, I'm like, I've got some really good chapter cliffhangers.
Yeah, right.
But that was because it was like, okay, I'm going to get to the turn of the action.
Yeah.
And then that gives me fodder for what's coming next that I can percolate on until I go until the next, and right to the next to the end.
I like that as an insight for how you keep going when you are going in fits and starts.
Right. Yeah.
I have to make one correction to what I just said. I said you don't need a lot of good sentences. What I meant was you don't need a lot of lyrical sentences.
Yes. Yeah. All sentences should be good.
That's right. All the sentences, but there are lots of different kinds of good sentences.
Exactly. They can be your best workday wear. They don't have to be your Sunday best.
There you go. That's right. You talked a minute ago, and you may not have any more to say about this, and that's okay if you don't, but you talked about writing to the deadline or writing to the meeting and writing from the meeting when you were talking about meeting with your writers group. And do you have any more to say about that? Because I really like that insight.
Yeah.
And again, it feels like a kind of helpful thing to remember, especially in your situation where you got a lot going on besides writing books.
Yeah. Well, I think so. The writing to the meeting part is just, when you have people who are expecting something, they don't need a polished beautiful thing. They want to know what's next. It's the kid at bedtime, when mom's making up stories or dad's making up stories, and what happens next? What happens next? So you've got sort of that external motivator of, I want to tell them the next part of this. And we would laugh at our Bandersnatch team meeting or Bandersnatch writing group meetings. Just like, I'd be like, well, I have 4 pages, and they're like, great, and then,
better than 0 pages.
Right. Exactly. And with, Rosefire, we can come back to this, but I had a period that I didn't write a single thing for 6 months straight, and kind of restarted. And one of the people who was part of that is my good friend Christine, who was my roommate at the time. And she came back from being away for the summer and was like, would you read it to me? And, I had a good amount at that point. I was maybe halfway through overall. But once I started reading it to her, then I started catching up to where I was. And so then I had to keep writing in order to stay ahead. But it was that someone who had an expectation and who had a desire to take part in it. And one of the things I love about Diana's book is she talks about not going into this meeting.
Bandersnatch.
Yes, sorry. Diana Gleyer's book, Bandersnatch, she talks about not going into those meetings, that kind of collaborative meeting, with something very polished that you're very precious about, but going in with something that's just kind of the raw words on the page, because A, you'll be more open to the feedback, but B, it's just a more malleable time in the work that you're working on, and people can give insight. So that's kind of the writing to the meeting. For me, then, the writing from the meeting comes from the feedback I've been given, and that was, I really like where you're going with that character, or, this was a really interesting, or, I don't understand how this worked. Can you help me clarify that? And all of those pieces and the questions that arise, the excitement that comes if you had something good, all of those things then are just fodder for, you're like, oh, okay, I know where I'm going next. I want to do something more with this character now. That sort of thing.
No, I love that insight of just, writing to the meeting, just getting something on paper, not being, as you said, precious about it, knowing that the way I'm going to make this better is, it's good. It's really trusting the process. As we talk about this, I'm going to know where to go. I'm going to be energized. Yeah. Have you ever come out of a writer's group less inclined to, discouraged? And you have anything you want to say about the Donahues that ways it or otherwise?
I mean, one time Rachel
here's your
was so
chance.
mean. No, I have not. And I think some of that is I have incredibly encouraging and kind friends. Yeah. But also I think some of that's just my personality that, I can take a lot of guff, and I appreciate the feedback, and especially if it's not given to me in a cruel manner. And so the feedback spurs me on to make something else, or to make it better, or to go on from it, as opposed to discouraging me and telling me I should scrap the whole thing.
Yeah. So you say this took, I think you said 5 years to write. Rosefire took 5 years to write. I'm assuming if it took you 5 years, you weren't writing steadily for 5 years. You said
no. Yeah.
Were there really long periods when you just
Yeah. So one of those periods was as I was writing my grad thesis. So focus was somewhere else. And I honestly, I came up with the idea for Rosefire the semester before my thesis semester, and I was doing a creative thesis. So I was writing a book for a thesis. And I debated, should I work on this, or I had another idea already. And it really came down to which advisor I wanted to work with. I really wanted to work with Dr. Wertheim, who was my advisor. And I knew that my other work, it's a historical fiction based on the lives of my great-grandparents, using their journals and letters and things like that. So it really, though it's written as fiction, pulls a lot of the memoir kind of things. my professor was a memoirist. Like, that was his field. And I was like, I want to learn from him about this craft and this kind of creating a story. And so I just decided to go with the other piece for that, which I haven't published yet, but, someday. I basically wrote a novella, and I'm like, do I write the other half of it, or do I release a novella? I don't know. And so that was one, large block of time that I was not working on Rosefire at all, except for, maybe on Sunday morning when I got bored during a sermon. And then the other very significant block of time was, for me, it was kind of end of 2011 into 2012. And so I'd been working, like I said, I was probably about halfway through the story at that point. But there was about 5 different tragic losses in my life, all in a couple of month period of time. And then at the same time, my job was very demanding. And, so it was all of these things together. I think the grief and the trauma of those losses, as well as the demands of a day job. I pulled them out last night, notebooks. And I tend to just sort of have one notebook that I write down everything in and just have that with me. So it's my sermon notes. It's my, story ideas. It's whatever it happens to be. If I hate underlining in books, so I just write out the sentences when I'm reading a good book and things like that. And so I look at one of these notebooks, and there's from about January 2012 until July, there is one entry, and it wound up being the final scene of Rosefire. But that is the only thing I put down on paper. Like, I didn't even take notes during sermons for the 7 months there. And a lot of that was just, I just couldn't. Nothing was coming. And I came kind of the end of that season was it wasn't a great light bulb moment, but one of the pieces was my friend Saritha, who's an artist. She came over for dinner one night, and I have no recollection what we talked about, but we'd both been through a lot of what I was dealing with. And both of us, after that night, whatever our conversation was, both were able to create something. Again, I wrote a few pages. She painted a painting. My roommate, Christine, came back after having been away for the summer and asked if I would read it to her. And so that was, again, the motivation. And then the kind of the third piece in the puzzle was actually going to my very first Touch Moot conference that fall of 2012. And it was this just drinking in the beauty, drinking in all of the wisdom and knowledge that I was seeing there at Hushmoot, and just being refilled and refreshed and going, oh, right, I can create. I am created by a creator who wants me to create, and so kind of that was sort of July through end of September, beginning of October period. And that's really, then I got back in gear, and I finished the first draft by the next summer.
Well, I'm curious, how did that 7-month period of trauma and grief and suffering shape your work that you did when you did start back?
Yeah.
If that's something that may not be something you want to talk about.
No, I'm happy to talk about it. I haven't even asked myself that question before, so let me see if I can think of how it did. I think, a lot of one of the major themes in Rosefire is the fear of death, and what does death mean, and is there eternity beyond death? And so having, multiple deaths kind of coming at anytime I have had someone close to me die. I'm a Christian. I believe they go to heaven, so anytime that has happened in my life, I feel like the veil has gotten a little bit thinner. You know, it's not just this nebulous things happen after death. It's like someone I know is no longer in this plane of existence. And I don't know exactly what the next plane of existence is. But the, you know, that veil, that, I don't even, the division feels lighter. And so I think that definitely kind of would have woven itself into Rosefire. I think that the value of the friendships and how that collaboration, not even in a writing sense. I mean, my two friends at that point who really were, I mean, the book's dedicated to them because they were my impetus for continuing to tell the story. Neither of them at that point would have called themselves writers. And Christine, I remember especially, we kept talking about, like, she came to Hutchmeet one year and she's like, what do I call myself? You know, and we just trying to figure out, and she, one of the things I have said to her is she's a namer. She's a person who's able to see in someone else, this is your gift, go do it. Yeah. And so she did that for me. And so those weren't even, you know, I wasn't going to a writing group. I wasn't getting critical or constructive writing feedback. It was just the encouragement of a band of sisters. And the story that I tell is the story of a storyteller. And she doesn't know that she's the storyteller until someone says, that's your part. That's what you're doing. I think that was part of the process. Rosefire is a story about a storyteller, and she doesn't know that she's the storyteller until her friends come around her and name her as tell the stories. Like, that's your part. And so, you know, I have a namer in my story because I had a namer in my life.
That's, man, I love that you're saying that. I mean, we need people who, as you said, tell us who we are. Nobody gives themselves their own name. Right. That's great. As you were talking about your 7 months without writing, you know, one thing that occurred to me is, as important as writing is, it's not the most important thing in the world.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And sometimes life intervenes, and you are things that, you know, it's very appropriate for you to not be writing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so many people felt that this past year with the pandemic, where, you know, you're suddenly like, oh, well, I'm at home. And of course, all of the memes on social media were like, well, if you don't get a novel written, you're wasting your time. Yeah. And yet so many of my friends were just stymied.
Yeah.
And, you know, the stress and the losses and, you know, all of the things that we were dealing with, those mess up your creativity. They sap the energy that you would normally pour into creative energy. And I think, you know, being able to forgive ourselves for that and be okay with it, not shame ourselves for it, and look forward and say, okay, so where do I go from here?
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. It is a strange thing how much shame we feel about not being productive.
Yeah.
There are so many things that are outside of your control when it comes to.
Right.
I mean, there are things that are in your control, and you should control the things you can control. And then there's some things that aren't.
Exactly.
And but I think it's because, you know, writers, artists have their identity wrapped up in that kind of creativity in ways that, you know, other occupations or other habits or not, hobbies or whatever don't. And so, you know, if I'm not a writer, who am I?
Right.
Well, you're a human being. And you're part of a community, and you're part of a family, and you're, you know.
Yeah.
And so so important to know that you're separate from your work. And yes, I mean, it's silly. I mean, I always make comparisons to plumbers, and it's not the same thing. It's silly to say that it's just like being a plumber. It's not just like being a plumber. Mm-hmm. But at least, one thing I appreciate about plumbers is they can separate their work from themselves.
Right.
When the pipe leaks, and they go fix it, but they don't say, I guess I'm not a plumber after all.
Exactly.
Okay. We are coming to the end of our allotted time. So you may know what you have to do before you leave, and that is you have to tell us who are the writers who make you want to write.
Yeah, I do know that. And you would not believe how many writers have gone through my head as I've thought about how would I answer this question. I think the first is just the poets. And I say that very broadly because pretty much any poetry can inspire me. But particularly, I mean, Eliot is a perfect example. I think I'm a terrible poet who loves poetry. Right.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I love how
I like basketball, but I can't.
Right. Exactly. I love how a poet can distill into a tiny phrase a whole world. Mm-hmm. And what inspires me is, there's that phrase, I want to unpack the whole world. Mm-hmm. And the whole story. And so that's song lyrics, that's poems, that's worship songs. I mean, the number of times that I've been, in church and there's like a line and there's a story in my head from one line. And so that's definitely a big one. John the Evangelist, John's Gospel. And I think that goes somewhat hand in hand with the poetry. It is a very poetic gospel, but John's Gospel is such a beautiful telling of the greatest story. And I just want to unpack pieces of that and retell it in new ways. And that's so exciting to me. Russ Ramsey, I love his Retelling the Stories series. And that so often, again, it's a telling of the greatest story. And so therefore I come into it and I'm seeing something new and I want to tell a story. I've got, a work in very slow progress, that two of the characters are from essentially a throwaway line in, the King of Glory one. The one for Easter, that one. And so I'm sure it's not a throwaway line, but, it's not the main point of the day.
Yeah.
And Madeleine L'Engle, I think I've read a lot of her work, both for children, for young adults, for writers, and for adults. And I think based on what I've read of her process, we probably had she was definitely much more diligent than I am, but probably a similar way of approaching creativity. And so many of her stories, the characters are characters that I've had as friends since I was a child. And so I think that's really, really inspiring. And I mean, there's so many authors that I love, but they aren't necessarily the ones who make me want to write.
Sure.
And I'm trying to think if there's anybody else. Nate Wilson, N.D. Wilson's books. His are more like, I read them and go, well, never going to have prose that good. But, but it is like, ooh, there's something to aim for in terms of direction. I have no expectation of being able to write about wind scratching its back on grass, which is such a great picture. But
I think you've got it in you, Carrie. I have every confidence.
Thank you.
Well, Carrie Givens, thank you so much for being here, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. and all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.